take one. Take one of one. Welcome, everybody, to a very special podcast. Today, I'm going to start with our usual suspects that we have with us, but then I'm going to go into our VIP guests that we have on today. With us on the Unily side is myself, Caitlin Oriema, and Alex Scabelli and Kaz Hassan. If you've been listening, you're familiar with all of us. I won't go into our backgrounds. More importantly, we have two very special guests with us today who are going to be talking about their new book that's out and going to be talking about all the great things with that and why we're so excited to welcome them to the podcast today and share all this great information and knowledge with you. I'll start with Paul Miller, who is the CEO and founder of Digital Workplace Group. And with us as well, we also have Shamrit James, who is the Director of Knowledge for DWG, or Digital Workplace Group. So we're really excited to talk about your new book, which you both co-authored, Nature of Work, the New Story of Work for the Living Age. Let's start with just kind of why we're here today and a little bit of background about the book and kind of what prompted you to write it.
Yeah, should I pick that one up, Shamrit?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think I've written a few books about technology and work in the past, digital workplace, digital renaissance of work, and early days of 2019, Shamrit and I talked about the idea of writing a book together, and we were playing around with different ideas, and I found myself, as I often do, walking. In a particular walk, I go on with my dog Hector through a little forest called Whitley Copse here in the Cotswolds. And on one kind of reflective walk, I asked myself, walking through the forest, how is this different to an organisation? In what way is this system, this natural system, different from an organisation? And started reflecting on the fact that in the forest, invisible are the roots of the forest. And the roots connect, feed the health of the forest, but are invisible. So if you're Unilever, Procter & Gamble, what part of your organisation is invisible that affects the health of the organisation? And Shamrit and I just started kind of playing with ideas around the idea of organisations as being alive. That we've been through 250 years of organisations as machines, created at the beginning in the industrial age, and we assume that's the only story of work. But actually, prior to that mechanistic industrial story didn't exist. And so really what we started talking about was this idea of organisations as being living systems, not a factory, but a forest. And Shamrit, we started chatting about that, didn't we?
We did, through many conversations in many different ways. And there was something about the idea that appealed on such a visceral level, I think, when you think about work and the stories of work that we've inherited from our parents, from culture, from family and friends. It's often a story of slog. Of you kind of check in at 9, check out at 5, you do your time, you do your work, and you keep doing that, and you retire, and then have your kind of winter of your years. And I think for a long time, that's been the story that we've believed around what work can be. It's been a lot of people's experience of work as well, and that's because of this mechanistic approach and story that we've all inherited. Whereas if we flip that and take the idea of nature and inspiration from nature and the idea of a living system and apply that to work, because all an organization is ultimately is a community of people and a community of relationships. So, and we are of nature ourselves. So if we take those ideas and apply them to the world of work, what kind of change can we instigate with that new story and that we can pass on to future generations? So as Paul and I kind of talked it through, there was something about it that felt very appealing and hopeful in a way that I think we both needed, and the more that we spoke to people around us, it felt that they needed as well.
Yeah, and just to kind of say, we've been toying with the idea that the next stage of the digital workplace, if you like, the digital world of work was more digital. And to some extent it is. It's intelligent systems, it's AI, it's robotics. But that felt like the same story kind of extended. It's a story of what I would call tool-based evolution. So the tools get more and more sophisticated, and that's a good thing, but it's not fundamentally different. And really this idea, if you think about it, is that technology is bringing life into organizations and has done. So when you think about the tools that, for example, Unily create, you're building relationship, collaboration, connection, information. So you're taking a system and you're adding vitality into it. And then when you start to think about it, this concept of seeing the entire organization as literally being an ecology is an extension of that. So our theory here, our suggestion, was that we're not actually moving into a digital age, we're actually moving into a living age. And that's to do with an entirely different relationship between work and that which is alive, human beings, nature, the planet. And the other thing that we wanted to do was create a book that sort of slightly confounded expectations. So it looks like a coffee table book about nature and trees and forestry, but it's actually a business book about work. And I think this line, the new story of work for a living age, and is really fundamental. I was talking to somebody at the IMF, and they were saying that it's really bringing new language into the world of work, and that by bringing new language in, you create new realities. Does that make any sense at all, Shimri? Or did I waffle on?
No, you got it all wrong. No, it was perfect sense. Perfect sense.
I have a question. So, had a look at the book, and you're right, it is like very unique for a business book, and I've read many, and this is probably, like, you're right, it's very visual, lots of imagery. It is kind of, you've got so much elements of nature embedded within the book, and it's very different. You spoke a little bit about like the sort of conversations you had, but I'm also kind of intrigued as to, like, you know, your guys' backgrounds, kind of how you got there, like how did this evolve from your backgrounds, and how did you two kind of come together to then spark that in particular? Because it is unique, and I suspect you've both got different backgrounds that fed it in to become the product that it is. But I'm really intrigued as to like how that evolved, and is there like history there? And yeah.
It's interesting because I had a conversation with a colleague of ours over summer, I've lost track of time, a couple of months ago, where she asked, because I live in North London, she said, what's your relationship with nature like, seeing as you live in like North London? And I think, you know, there's this idea of biophilia, which is our humans' innate draw to nature, regardless of where we are, whether it's in a building or out in the sticks or in the center of a city. We have this innate draw to nature, and it's something that I've always felt acutely, even though I live where I live. And I think that desire as well to want to see a better world for me personally is something I've always felt, and trying to find ways to start to bring that into my working life. It was always something that was on my radar and wanted to be able to do. This idea, you know, when you're a kid, you want to change the world, and then you progressively make decisions that you have to compromise on those things. And so when, you know, Paul and I, we worked together. I've been in DWG in one way or another for about 7 years now. So we've worked together in that way for 7 years and known each other for 7 years. And then it's over the last 3-ish years, we've started working more closely together and exploring ideas like, what does digital mean for a nation at the civic level? What does it mean for society? And we've experimented in that space a little bit together around something we called the Digital Nations Group. And then as our conversations progressed and we got to know each other better, we found different connections around how we feel about nature, the world, society, how it can be improved. And it kind of happened in quite a natural way. And so for us to have those conversations felt like a natural progression for the relationship, I think. And so even though I live in North London, when Paul had his experience, his gorgeous experience of being in the woods with his dog Hector, And he came to me, and I'm sat in my apartment on the 12th floor in North London. But actually, as I look out the windows, London looks like a forest to me. It looks like a city that has emerged from a forest, because I have that bird's eye view. And I think that is what has become embedded in the book in terms of that perspective, why nature, and why do we think we can change the world of work using that story. That's kind of my perspective. Paul, what's yours?
I don't really know how to answer that question. The honest answer is I don't really know where the book came from. I mean, what I would say is that, you know, if you go back to 2019, Greta Thunberg, the school strikes, the children, the kind of sense that climate, earth, nature was in peril and urgency. And just to kind of, I really don't know. It felt like it was almost like a story that needed to be told. And what I liked, I suppose, was that by looking at nature and standing in front of a tree and saying, what's the purpose of this tree? Now, there's a sense, you know, it's clearly not there simply to take in carbon monoxide and produce carbon dioxide. It's not there simply to provide beauty to human beings, but there's a sense that the tree's got what I would call deep purpose. And isn't that then, maybe because we're exposed on a daily basis to so many major organizations, asking themselves, what is the purpose of each organization? Our own organization. What's the purpose of IKEA? What's the purpose of Verizon? What's the purpose of HSBC? And this sense that if they could connect into deep purpose in the same way that nature does, this could be a really powerful way forward. And one of the things that I did was test these like theories out with people in different organizations, testing this idea, you are alive. And what I noticed was that I was getting this level of enthusiasm from senior leaders inside organizations. They were talking about what they did at university. They were talking about studying geology. They were talking about their children. And I thought there's something happening here that we're tapping into. And then I don't know why, but Shimrit and I just seemed to kind of bring a kind of blend of things to each other. And it was I think for me, it was definitely the most creative book that I've been involved in.
I think as well, we had an amazing group of people with us. Like we're the two on the podcast, it's our names on the book, but we had such an amazing supportive team around us who challenged us, helped us with research, helped us with the editing of photography. And I think that collaboration between that group of people has made it what it is and helped feed the ideas as well and helped challenge us. We had our director of research, Elizabeth, challenged us to be bold and unapologetic. And that became our mantra, I think. Every time we got stuck, that came back to us. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that that concept of, you know, like what is our purpose or why are we here? What's the foundation? We've talked about that before. We talk about that a lot at Unily, and we've talked about it actually on this podcast too, because to me, I think when I'm most engaged at work is when I feel very connected to the purpose of the company. Like, what is the end goal? What are we all working towards? What's the foundation? How did we start and where are we going? So I think that's something that anybody who's listening and anybody who would be reading the book can connect to on a very deep level, both at work and in personal relationships as well. And I'm curious too, just listening to the passion and everything behind the book and these topics and the root of it. When you were, Paul, founding Digital Workplace Group too, or do you think some of this are some of the guiding principles that led you to founding the company, and you know how you interact with clients and what you support them in working towards too?
Yeah, I think a lot of my story of work has been informed by a kind of strange incident that happened to me when I was about 15, and I had a holiday job in North Manchester where I worked stacking and sort of moving around exhaust pipes in a warehouse. And what I did was, you got like 3 breaks during the day for 10 minutes and 1 break at lunchtime for half an hour. And I would run as far away from the factory as I possibly could, run 15 minutes in one direction and run 15 minutes back, because I found the whole experience so awful, and I thought, is this work? And it kind of left in me a real sense that work could be, or should be, or would be in my life, if I could make it happen, significantly more fulfilling, that it would be actually a product of enjoyment. Why should it only be the likes of a David Hockney who can say, I'm going to work 7 days a week until I kind of have my last breath? So a lot of the things I've tried to do in my own work is create organizations and companies that actually express things that I find enjoyable, and trying to turn them into commercial propositions. I think the work of DWG is really trying to bring a new concept of work, really, through technology, into organizations that would like to create more engaging, more fulfilling, more rewarding, more purposeful environments.
I think as well, in the book we talk about regeneration and life cycles, and how can you apply that to an organization. I think one of the things with DWG is it's been through its evolutions. We look at the lifespan of organizations and how they're contracting over time and kind of dying much earlier than they have done historically, versus those that are able to regenerate and evolve depending on what's going on outside. So I think with DWG, it's been through 2 iterations, I think, so far, or evolutions. Paul, you had IBF and then you had DWG, and now we're going through another evolution. So I think that those principles are embedded within the organization.
I think, and I know you mentioned this in your book about, obviously, we've been through a period of great change. And I know that everybody's very aware of that because it's been so global. But I guess I'm sort of curious about if any of that, and again, there's a lot of reference to looking back at nature and seeing what we can do with that. And certainly for me, having had a career that sort of grew with digital in a way, and feeling like throughout it was always one or the other. It was almost like by entering the digital age, you were either sort of trying to mimic nature or trying to push at nature or use it to explore nature. And now I see this option where it's sort of saying, it isn't either or. It's like, instead of trying to copy it, create it, or push it into a box, why don't we look at nature and learn from it without sort of considering any of the things we've done before the industrial age, and all the things where we've tried to kind of force it to our will, and look at nature and see how, even though we tried all those things all those years, it still came back. It still kept growing and adapting and learning. And I guess it's sort of looking at that and saying, do you see that as something that really enterprises now, having had to adapt and learn over the past 18 months, could use that, and instead of continuing to try to, I guess it sounds like it's like battle with nature, but it's more like looking at nature and saying, you know what, no matter what you did to it, it still grew and it flourished and it kept itself, and that's the where we should be looking. We should be absolutely learning from it. It's almost a little different from knowing it's right next to me, and more looking at it saying, how did the tree survive? What do those roots do? How do they keep that tree alive despite the fact that I've planted a whole city around it? It's like, how can we bring those lessons, I mean, for me personally, to the clients I work with, but to my life in general, really.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because obviously we started writing it in sort of September 2019, when nobody knew about global pandemics apart from in history. And so we were some way into writing the book when the pandemic arrived. And one thought we had was the pandemic sort of makes the book kind of irrelevant, obsolete. And then we started to read through it. You're alive. You're a living system. You know, and all of a sudden, you know, the kind of hairs on our, you know, it was kind of, it was quite a visceral experience of, wow, and the other thing we'd done as a company is we'd started talking in our own podcast about the decade of courage, that the 2020s was going to be the decade of courage, and that this is all pre-pandemic, and then of course COVID arrives, and actually what we started to do was just keep writing and absorbing some of the stories from the NHS, from organizations like Kodak, who are repositioning themselves, reconfiguring this hyper collaborative approach that AstraZeneca were doing. And we've got a forward from Manisha Singh, who's a director of employee experience at AstraZeneca, about the phenomenal collaboration happening. And it really brought home that organizations are not just alive as a theory. I mean, right at the moment, as we record this, people in companies can't physically come together in the way they used to because they're alive. So we're actually dealing with the reality of being a living system. I mean, what I would say is that then COVID has kind of fractured the world of work. I mean, it's somewhat accelerated trends that were already there. I actually think it's fractured it, and we don't really know what work is fully anymore yet. However, if you then start to look to nature as a metaphor, as a guide, as something that's preceded us as human beings, and as you say, Alex, rides through all these different iterations. So if you want to look at relationships, if you want to look at the topic of diversity and inclusion, why not look at biodiversity, which sort of frames it in a larger setting of what is the diversity you need in a forest, in a particular land, for it to be as rich as possible, inclusion of all different species. If you want to look at, I mean, I was talking to somebody, quite a senior guy in a pharmaceutical company, and behind him yesterday he had a forest. And I said, so which tree is CEO of the forest? And if you took one tree away, at what point wouldn't it be a forest? And obviously these things can sound a little bit kind of crazy, sort of. Sometimes I think I've been sort of returned to the 60s, even though I missed the 60s, you know, but it's really that they're such a useful place for us to kind of move towards. As we're thinking, we've got 12 elements in the book: purpose, relationships, structure, regeneration, life cycle. We talk about BMW looking forward for the next 116 years after their first 116 years, looking at these regenerative cycles. And actually you start to realize the more you dig into it, the more that it gives us a much richer story. And again, it doesn't preclude the digital age, but what I would say is that the digital age is a subset of a living age, and the digital age is just an extension of the industrial age, the tool-based age, the information age. And I think the challenge for us now is to kind of bring the digital age into a living kind of philosophy for any organization.
And if it's fractured, as you said as well, looking back at nature as well, and covering those topics, you know, in terms of regeneration and that whole cyclical nature of nature. But overall saying, well, if work was fractured, and I don't mean this necessarily as a negative thing, because again, it's that sort of sometimes these fractures need to happen for you to recognize what has just happened, and then to be able to look at that and say, well, we fractured nature multiple times and it has come back new in different ways. It's grown. We have different, you know, species. There is more biodiversity in some places and less in others. But as a result of that, can we then look at that, learn from that, and say, well, work too will repair itself, but we just don't know what it'll look like. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I hadn't really thought about that, but one of the things in nature is that organizations want to expend as little effort to achieve their, if you like, their outputs as possible. And nature's somewhat like that. So in a way, by planting the right seeds of relationship, if you cultivate trust inside a company, the organization will then self-actualize. And consequently, you don't need to be pushing and forcing the change. So this is, Shamrit and I interviewed the CEO of Cook, or the co-CEO of Cook, the ready meals company. And she said so they were inundated with people stocking up on ready meals through COVID. And she said we had a residue of goodwill inside the company that they could tap into. They didn't need to pay people more to do it. It was there already. So I think what we're seeing is the organizations that foster relationships, trust, purpose, these things won't cost you any more as a company. I mean, we've just decided to give everybody in the company a week's free holiday in August. We're going to close the office for a week and everybody's just going to have a week off for free. And it's not to manipulate people in the company to do something more when they come back or get down on bended knees and be eternally grateful. It's to say thank you. And also for our system, if you like, to rest and to have faith that will be, in the spirit of being a living organizer. I don't know. I think, Shimrit, we probably wouldn't have done that prior to the nature of work. Might have given people a day's holiday, but not a week's holiday.
That's good to hear. I think as well, the word that comes to mind for me is stewardship. I think, there's a lot going on at the moment in terms of looking at Indigenous peoples and what their knowledge of the land is and what can we learn from that and what have we ignored kind of in our arrogance of thinking that we can control nature. It's, again, that industrialized view of we can manage it, we can control it, we can measure it, we can bring it to bear on our will. As you say, Alex, that hasn't worked. Nature regenerates, it comes back. And so, I'm reading a book called Sand Talk at the moment, which is about Indigenous knowledge and what can we learn from it. And he talks about the idea of stewardship and that responsibility that we have to the land rather than what can the land do for us. And if we take that and think about the world of work and we think about organizations, leaders, all the rest, are they trying to control the community, control the people, control the outputs, or actually are they thinking about stewarding relationships and what can they do to create that connection and that trust so that people are able to as you were saying, Caitlin, the idea of purpose, how can they be purposeful so that they have satisfaction personally, so that when they go home, or if they're at home already, considering what's happened over the last year, but when they close off for the day, they bring that sense of satisfaction to their families, because this is when we talk about living systems, there's ripple effects for everything. If someone has had a bad day at work, it impacts the family. And so understanding that idea of nested systems, the individual, the team, the organization, the community, society, and how it all links together, I think looking to nature and the idea of ecosystems, the idea of mutual relationships, the idea of interconnected purpose where you're not just taking to survive but you give back to help others survive as well, is really what's needed as we now move forward into whatever comes next in society to help heal those fractures, as you said.
Yeah. I think all of us, right, are under more pressure than ever to balance the concept of, because I know in the book you talk about kind of the, work has left the building and we're all under a lot of pressure for this concept of work from anywhere, everywhere, anytime, right? We have the digital tech and the technology, digital tools and technology to work 24/7 if we wanted to. So then it's also balancing, has my organization provided me with this technology to enabled me to efficiently work so that I can, build relationships and then connect and do other things outside of my, 9-to-5 job or whatever it is, right, that I'm doing? Or is it the pressure to like work all the time, right? We can get email messages, Teams messages on our phones all day, all night. So it's also, I think, a lot about that, about balancing that, and also as an organization, stating the purpose of why you're enabling people with the tools that they have to balance the digital with, and I guess this whole concept of nature. So I'm just curious about that. And I know Kaz has talked previously a lot about like productivity and efficiency and changes there with the way we work. So I'm sure you have something you could add on to that too.
Yeah. So I have a question. So I guess like one thing I kind of took away from reading was your guys' focus on like finding new terminology, or how like language is super important in kind of reimagining the workplace. And I think from some of my experiences with clients I've worked with in the past, perhaps there's been a lot of emphasis on this kind of idea of output and process, and this kind of like time on task type emphasis. And I'm not saying that's kind of incorrect, but that there still is a bit of that focus. I don't know whether it's ingrained within us or whether it's something that's evolved. But I guess from kind of like a moving forward terms of way, do you see this kind of nature of work practice and this kind of language as being something that is an evolution of where we are? It's the next step on our journey, and we've come to a better, more rounded place, and we're now evolved? Or do you see it something that kind of it complements what we're in, and there are just parts of it that we kind of need to embed in the way that we're working, and that kind of, do you see what I mean? Is it an evolution, or is it something that kind of complements and changes what we're in?
Well, I think the analogy I would say is, so we're not saying that organizations should become living systems. What we're saying is that any community, any organization is already alive. It has a story that it tells itself that's more mechanistic than living system. So it's a bit, one of the analogies I use, it's a bit like looking at a landscape through a lens, and the lens is out of focus. And gradually you start to focus the lens, and you can then see the landscape. But the landscape was already there. So I think what the language does is, so organizations have been talking for the last 20 years about collaboration, relationships, experience. Now, I've got a car here. It doesn't have any relationships. It doesn't have any experience. It doesn't innovate. It doesn't collaborate. So actually, we've already been talking about terms that are of the living age. And these terms are evocative of that. And I think really all we're doing is putting additional, if you like, story arc around this. I mean, what I would say is that the things around productivity, if output, these are really part of the mechanistic story that has had I think it was successful for a couple of 100 years until it ceased to be successful, and we didn't wake up and then basically spent the last 40 or so years just doing damage through it, while also accruing economic and financial value. So, but I think it really made sense. I think if you went back, 50 years, that story of work really was a story that was meaningful. But then once you start to look at efficiency and I suppose productivity, and then start to put it into a forest kind of setting, there's no wasted resource. Trees don't, their leaves are shed in winter in order that when the wind comes, they'll be more resilient. There's an efficiency of use of resources and an intelligence that we barely understand. And we discovered this writing the book with a very cursory sort of understanding of ecology and the hidden life of trees and so on. There are things going on where, it could well be that nature's actually more intelligent than us as a species, that, the natural world, we just don't know it. But, I'm not, it's a different kind of intelligence, I think. So I do think that language is important. We start off by talking about the film Arrival, one of my favourite films, and these, so the aliens come down. Instead of trying to destroy us, what they're actually trying to do is give us a new language, because in giving us a new language, they give us a new level of meaning and reality. It is fascinating, the effect that language has on an organisation, changing the folklore.
Yeah, and I mean the importance of language. One of the elements that kind of got left on the cutting floor was seasons, because we realised actually it overlaps with life cycle, and you can talk about seasons within the idea of life cycle. But the reason I bring it up is nature itself rests. Through winter, it has that phase of rest so that it can then regenerate. And I think, the idea of productivity, output, time to task. Caitlin, you asked, the idea of you can work from anywhere, anytime, but should you? People aren't resting to be able to recover. And, there are so many articles at the moment about the rates of burnout that people are feeling after the last year. And I remember seeing someone say rest is actually a part of work. It's not separate to it. I've joked with friends that if we have a nap in the middle of the day, it's actually part of working, because there's no way I could have co-written the book with Paul without napping in the middle of the day, or lying down to allow my brain to do whatever it was that it needed to do to have that creativity, to get to the next bit, or to create, solve a problem. My dad used to work from home when I was a kid, and you could tell when he was stuck on a problem because he would go for a walk around the block. And I think we've forgotten that. And there's a book that I really want to read saying Laziness Does Not Exist by someone called Devon Price. And it's this idea that we almost feel guilty for resting in the current culture and the current climate. Like if we rest, if we take the time to pause, if we take the time to set our boundaries and say, my work finishes at this time and I'm then done and moving on to something else, or I'm going to take the holiday I need and all the rest. That we're not being productive and we're not being effective. So this idea of time to task productivity, are you saying that me having a nap because I need to focus on the next chapter of the book isn't me being productive? You can't time record that, but it's an essential part of the process. Same for anyone else, regardless of what line of work you're in. We need that time to recover. So I think having that idea of nature of work, it's an evolution of that thinking of productivity and all the rest of it. You need to reintegrate this idea of recovery and rest and fallow time, which we can take from nature, to start to talk about that with clients, with our members, for example, with each other in our own organizations. And it gives you the language to be able to talk about that in a meaningful way.
I do. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. I was just going to wholeheartedly agree. That's all.
I mean, one of the things, obviously, COVID has brought is the fact that people have been exhausted, scared. The word of 2020 in leadership circles was empathy. It wasn't the word of 2019. But I think once you've developed empathetic leadership, you don't then go, okay, now the pandemic's behind us, I'll go back to ceasing to empathize. I think it's once you've opened up that capacity, but I think the level of fatigue, burnout. So we've got the final element is on health. So we start off with purpose, and then we end with health. And obviously we're used to the idea of financial health as a marker of health of an organization. But what about innovation health? What about relationship health, trust health? I mean, American Express wants to recruit the best people in the world. So their capacity to attract the recruitment health, if you like, these are all indicators of health. And I think there's this strange thing, which is that, if you look at animals, when they're tired, they don't keep on going. They rest. Whereas human beings, they can be exhausted, but they're still working, and I think starting to give ourselves more license as we start to reimagine and regenerate as we move from pandemic to endemic, that we start to kind of, in a way, have a different rhythm to work.
I think as well, this doesn't just apply to I hate the idea of knowledge workers because everyone has knowledge in how they work, but the people who are typically in offices or desk-based, if you look at people who work in retail, who do work in factories, who work in warehouses, they are human, they are of nature, they have biology, and they need exactly the same things that everyone else needs, whether you're at a desk or in whatever. So the idea that Amazon put in a little sleeping pod on their factory floor doesn't change the conditions for those people in terms of how they're experiencing work. So it's not a plaster. It's not just if we do this, this, and this, we'll be fine. It's really reimagining what it is to have an organization and to work. So I think, again, the idea of evolution of language, this idea of learning from nature it enables you to have those conversations, I think, in a more meaningful way.
Companies like DWG and Unily have got a real opportunity here, I think, to deliver kind of technology, digital services, but to do it within this wider, if you like, more holistic context. So it's not saying let's stop making technology smarter, more capable, more intelligent, more adaptive, etc. That's useful, and that I think will happen and can support the world of work. But let's not think that's the utopian answer to humanity and work's future. Let's set it in a more sustainable and deeper context, which I think hopefully can amplify what we all do.
Yeah, and I think what we're leading into also, as we're talking through this, is that it's being empathetic as you're thinking about the digital workplace and the way in which you're designing it, right? And so I'm curious too, just as leaders at DWG and obviously experts in this subject matter in this space, how are you carrying these principles and all of the work that you did and the research you did with the book into your clients and how you're guiding them? With their digital workplace journeys and transformations that they're going through. Just kind of, I know that's a big question that we could probably talk about for hours, but just generally kind of how do you see kind of a change in how you're guiding them or consulting them on things?
I was going to say you pause if you wanted me to take that one. I think there's a couple of ways. Because it depends who we're talking to as well. So if we're just talking about the idea of nature of work, we're starting to integrate it into our member meetings. So starting to have conversations around what do these principles or these elements mean for you and how do they apply to the story of who your organization is. So we had an executive circle in March where we had some of our members join. I don't know if I can say who hosted it because I can't remember what the marketing things are, but they were talking about how they're evolving their digital workplace. And the final thing that we did was have a conversation with them about routes to regeneration. So who are they at their heart? What were the roots of the organization and how has that enabled them to regenerate over time? And throughout that whole conversation, we had questions to help them tease out what does that mean for the digital workplace. So the idea of the roots of the organization and who they are, how does that come through in internal communications? The idea of biodiversity, to what extent are you actually taking into full consideration the stories that are being told, the language that's being used, who is being included and excluded from the digital workplace? We've known for years that frontline workers, for example, are so often excluded from the digital workplace. So it's not supporting the full diversity of the organization when you design it in that way. The idea of roots as well in relationships, we've spoken about collaboration. So if you start to really understand your collaboration tools, not just as we need Slack or we need Teams or we need Yammer and we need SharePoint or to have Uni over the top of it or whatever, but really understanding what are the relationships that exist within the organization, how are people connected via root systems. If you see your digital workplace as a root system that connects different trees, people together, that enables knowledge to flow, that enables communication to flow, it changes the way you think about the technology. So that's one of the ways as well. And I think it's just bringing the language in to reimagine what the digital workplace is and can do, so that it helps refocus it on, rather than being user-centered, but being life-centered. And as soon as you talk about a digital workplace as life-centered, you're thinking about, okay, how does it work as a virtual habitat that people are living in day to day? How does that connect with the physical habitat that they're in at the moment that they're accessing and using the digital workplace? Because I think there's also been separation between physical and digital for years, even though we exist in the physical, even while we're using the digital. And all those things, I think, help you remember the human that is using the tools, and also the impacts. You know, Caitlin, you were talking about the idea of work from anywhere, work anytime, because the digital tools allow you to do that. The digital workplace is accessible 24/7. If you were to just roll out those tools and say, here you go, you can work, and you're a digital workplace team that just has that approach of we need to get the tools out, you're not thinking about the ripple effects of someone who feels the need to access their email or Teams, or is getting notifications on their phone at 11 in the evening, even though they don't really want to, and the culture around it that means they feel they need to check it. What are the unintended consequences of the technology in the digital workplace? So I think they're the ways that we're talking about it with our members and our clients. It's really that on a digital workplace level. And Paul, what would you add?
Yeah, well, Shamarit and I did a talk to quite a large audience at the International Monetary Fund a few weeks ago, and two topics that got picked up from the book. One was around habitat. So they're like every organisation, looking at return to work, anxiety about return to work, where are people going to work, how are we going to deliver our services to members of the IMF through missions, what's a virtual mission versus a physical mission, and by talking about it in the context of habitat, so you want an individual or a team to actually find themselves in their right habitat on any given day. It becomes less about office, home, working close to home. It becomes less about the physical location and more about finding the right habitat. And the other one was that, and it's true of a lot of organisations, the idea of purpose. So the IMF was set up after the Second World War to develop financial stability in the world. But increasingly, financial stability is connected to climate stability, environmental stability. So what they're trying to do is look at what their purpose for the 21st century as being an evolution. And I guess the book we've found has given people a catalyst for conversation and for stories. So we're still doing what I would call core digital workplace personas, user journeys, taxonomy, search, navigation, all of those things. But attempting to do it by bringing in this new language. So it's not a kind of you must be a living organisation. How dare you say anything other than that? It's really just trying to grow as an ecology when you start to think of yourselves, your partners, your clients. I mean, on some projects we work with Unily, so we're all part of the same living system. Mm-hmm. At what point do you guys end, your clients begin? What point do we? Once you start to step back, you start to see how connected we all are.
So I think with that, if we had to send all of our listeners home with one takeaway message, other than you need to read this book, because you do, because you need to get your hands on this book and read it and start to pull the practices into the workplace, what's one kind of takeaway that you would send our listeners with?
Oh, I'm thinking hard.
Okay,
now.
No pressure. No pressure.
Okay, so while you're thinking, what I would say is, you're alive, now what?
I love that.
Oh, do I need something pithy?
No. Is that pithy?
Expectations, yeah.
No, you want something deliberately unpithy.
Yeah, I can do that. Though I think the one takeaway is a question that I think we've asked people a couple of times now, which is really reflect on what stories of work have you inherited How have they shaped you over your career? How do they shape you day to day in the way that you treat your colleagues? And think about, what story do you want the next generation to inherit from us that we're going to tell? Do you want it to be the same as what you inherited? Or do you want it to be one of everything that we've spoken about here? And so just to reflect on that, and what the story of work means to you and what you want it to be.
I have to say one thing I've learned from this chat is, during some of our implementations and working with some of our clients, like, well, just actually from some of the language you use, like virtual habitat, for example, and like people's stories, I think too often when it comes to the digital workplace and kind of designing employee experiences, it can be perceived quite machine technology like, and actually it's not too difficult to take a step back to just think, okay, employee experience, actually that's people experience, and people have needs and people work in a certain way and people have these kind of biological needs, and how does that all fit together? Who are the people that sit within our organization? Why do they do the things they do? And I just think some of those like subtle changes in mentality, that just taking a step back can mean that actually we're not just implementing technology, we're using digital tools to complement or kind of make a part of our environment. And I love the term virtual habitat because it just encourages you to think slightly differently to, okay, we're implementing technology here are the steps we go through. So I love that. So thank you for kind of introducing that concept.
And just on that, one of the things that we've talked about for a few years, actually, it predates the book, was the idea of the digital headquarters. So, you're opening up the physical headquarters. It's, back in the pre-COVID days, people spent fortunes on them. Not saying they won't in the future, but, but what about the digital headquarters that everybody inside your organization can participate in? That's open to everyone. And I think it would be wonderful for those places to be distinctively beautiful in a way that the physical headquarters are. So why doesn't Barclays digital headquarters feel really Barclays? Why doesn't BMW's digital headquarters feel really BMW? And they're a bit too kind of functional and bland. And I feel like we could design these virtual habitats, these digital headquarters in that way. I like that.
And Kaz, just as you were talking, it reminded me of something as well. We had a conversation with one of our members a couple of weeks ago where they had brought to us the question of how can we get our leaders to buy into Yammer. So we thought, okay, that's simple. We all know the steps that you take around helping leaders understand the benefits of Yammer. We shared those with them. I said, no, we've done all that. And actually, when we got to under the question, it became about emotion, and it became about leaders feeling fear around all kinds of things connected to what Yammer represents. And, in the book, we talk about threats. And I think just focusing on the tools mean we often forget the emotion that sits behind our relationship with those tools and the different emotions that it brings up. So yeah, I think starting to become kind of emotionally intelligent in the work that we do is going to have a massive impact as well.
It's super, super helpful. Thank you so much. We are so grateful for the both of you joining us today, Paul and Shimri. Finally, too, I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware how they get their hands on Nature of Work. So where can everybody get the book?
Go to www.natureofwork.com. Mm-hmm. That's the best place to get it. You can download the first chapter
for
without
free.
buying it.
For free. Yeah.
For free.
Yeah.
That might be enough.